Relationships with avoidance tend to follow a very similar and predictable pattern. There are three main phases. Now, the timeline of each phase can vary from person to person, but the phases, they're usually there. And this is if you're dealing with a person that is severely dismissive avoidant or a fearful avoidant that leans heavily dismissive. The first phase is the shared fantasy. It's the love bombing phase, and it's called the shared fantasy because it is a fantasy. It's a romance novel. It's a fairy tale. It is not a real relationship yet because there's no real emotional intimacy. There's no real commitment. There's no real disagreements. There's no real expectations. The avoidance fears have not been triggered yet, but their dopamine levels running high. Dopamine is the reward hormone. It makes you feel good, and it definitely goes off a ton early in dating for everybody, not just avoidance. But the avoidant is riding that dopamine high, and they're feeling good, and they're letting all these bottled up emotions flow out onto you because their fears haven't been triggered yet, and their anxieties and fears are being numbed and suppressed by the dopamine. They think they got it right. They think you're the right person. They have you on a pedestal, and they are just pouring it onto you. But over the course of time, those dopamine levels come down. And now that the dopamine levels are coming down, as they naturally do, the infatuation fades and their insecurities rise to the surface. That brings us to phase number 2, which is the fault-finding phase. Now, their fears are being triggered, and they have a very specific set of fears that stem from consistent childhood emotional neglect, which they experienced in childhood. Fear of closeness, fear of vulnerability, fear of emotional intimacy, fear of confrontation because they associate that with rejection. They couldn't express their feelings as a kid. Fears of not meeting your expectations, of disappointing you because they had very high expectations on them as children for success, so they grow up feeling like any expectations are insurmountable to them. So their fears are getting activated by normal relationship behaviors. There's growing emotional closeness. You're really getting to know each other. The commitment is deepening. There are sometimes disagreements, and there's expectations, and they are really getting triggered. But they don't want to actually take accountability for these insecurities. They don't want to look within because that's too painful. There's a deep wound of shame. So they go into that fault-finding phase, meaning they start looking for anything they don't like in their partner, any kind of incompatibilities. Ooh, this person, yeah, they're not that punctual. They show up 5 minutes late and I'm a punctual person. Ooh, they really like Italian food and I don't like Italian food. Oh, they really like to scuba dive and I'm not a big diver. Trying to find any differences between the two of you so they can justify their fears of leaving. Because if they can find things that they don't like about you, well, now they don't have to take accountability for their urges to run away from a great relationship. It's your fault. Oh, if I was just with the right person, I wouldn't feel this way. We're just not compatible because they found the incompatibilities, meaning they found the faults in you. And when they find those faults in you, they don't have to look within and they can continue to avoid that core wound of shame. So now they've pinned it on you. They may or may not be communicating that to you in this phase though. They might be acting like everything is great, but meanwhile in their head, they're finding all these faults in you and they're using those faults as a way to justify their urges to run. They may even be negatively comparing you to one of their exes. Oh, this person, they do this way. My ex, oh, they didn't do that. Maybe my ex was the great one. Oh, looking for constant little ways to criticize you, critique you, compare you to others, and to create emotional distance between themselves and you, at least in their own mind. Now, sometimes they can actually start criticizing you in person, bringing up these critiques, little jabs here, little comments here, to create emotional distance between the two of you. And that brings to the last phase, the discard phase. That's it. Their fears have really risen sky high. They've found their justification to leave, and they're heading for the exit. And this might come as a blindsiding surprise to the person who's getting the rug pulled from under their feet, because they often don't communicate any of their fears or issues at all. And to them, it's not a surprise because they've had these fears that have been bottling up. It's been there in their mind, but they didn't tell you. And they've been acting like everything's great. So suddenly, you're on cloud nine one day, feeling like you have your forever person, and the next day, it is over. But they are cold, they are shut down, and they're showing you little to no empathy. Detaching from their emotions is how they've learned to keep themselves safe, because being vulnerable, expressing emotions, it wasn't welcome in childhood, so they have a lifelong habit of detaching when things get stressful. That's how they've learned to cope. But you are blindsided and devastated. And even if you might have seen it coming a little bit, they might have been pulling away, it is still really painful to go through because they're not giving you really any clear explanations, vague excuses as to why the relationship has to end. And it is just not a normal breakup. It is a one-sided, unilateral breakup where you truly feel discarded and like you're thrown in the trash, like you never even mattered. And the person that you thought was your person is showing really no empathy. They're not giving you closure. And it just feels like you never even mattered to this person. It is a very brutal thing to go through. Now, once that phase is done, they might come back down the road, especially if you go into no contact, because that allows them the time to let their fears subside and to feel safe again. But if they don't work on themselves, if they don't work towards healing and becoming more secure, this cycle will start again and again, and they'll go through it every single time they get into a relationship because of their unhealed attachment wounds. Of course, they can fix this, they can work on this, but it requires them to be willing to do changes, to do the inner work, to do things like therapy, commit to a change in behavior, and do new behaviors in repetition. But it's not because you weren't good enough as a partner. It has no reflection of your worth. It has no reflection on the quality of a partner that you were. This is this person's insecurities and attachment wounds that cause them to self-sabotage healthy relationships. And really drill that into your head because it's true.